Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest webinar. My name is Mark Catchlove and I'm part of the Miller Knoll Global Research and Planning Group. And in case you don't know Miller Knoll is a family of brands and they're all listed in front of you. And all these brands design and manufacture products for places where people live, where they learn, where they get healed, and where they work. And today we're very much going to be focusing on the subject of work, but we do know that people work often where they get healed and where they learn as well. So these will apply to those environments. Our guest speaker today, I'm really pleased to say we have Caitlin, who is at a company called Authentic Social, a sociologist and founder of Authentic Social. Today's talk is called Designing for Connection, a socio-technical approach. I'm going to let Caitlin talk a little bit more about herself and the subject. Please use the chat box for observations and questions. Caitlin, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, and great to be here virtually with everyone. Really excited about this discussion. And as Mark said, please feel free to use the chatbot to ask any questions, and please connect with me on LinkedIn and across social media if you have any things that weren't covered here that you'd like to go over. I'm very excited to be here to speak with everyone about designing for connection, a socio-technical approach. And don't worry, I will explain what socio-technical means. So first, before we dive into all that, a little bit about me and my background. So I am a sociologist and the founder of Authentic Social. And Authentic Social is an applied research lab at the intersection of sociology and technology. So we take a lot of great research and we apply it to business outcomes, whether that be sales and go-to-market or workplace design or things related to that. So I'm based in Lower Manhattan, and I also have a second office in Amsterdam. I am focused on this idea of designing a socio-technical future, and all of my work is actually based on my 2016 Harvard thesis on digital communication and its effect on everyday life and our relationships. I've been interested in this topic for a very long time now. So I founded Authentic Social in 2016 when I was still a senior, built on this thesis, worked at LinkedIn in Silicon Valley for about a year, and actually exactly a year, and then went full-time since then. I'm also the host of Progression to Analog, which is a podcast about exploring a more human everyday, ranges in topics from how we can approach AI from a human-oriented perspective to how we can have a better relationship with our phone. And I have listeners in 39 countries, which is exciting. And I also am a keynote speaker across the US and Europe. This photo that you see on the screen right now is from Brain Bar from last year, Europe's largest festival on the future. So now, as we get started, first, let's understand what socio-technical means. So socio-technical is a combination of two words, social and technical. So it's about this joint optimization of people and technology. So as we can see here, socio, people, technical, technology. So not as complicated as it might sound. Socio-technical refers to this interrelatedness of social and technical aspects of society. So we see this every day. People are on their phones when they're in public. We're using technology in our everyday lives. Everyday life is a socio-technical process. And so the desired outcome of this designing a socio-technical future is trying to make sure that there's a joint optimization between people and technology. Now, what that means in simple terms is that a lot of times organizations try to enact change through technical means. They think that technology can solve and fix and smooth everything and don't really think about the people and how they play a role in all of this. And that's where it's important. And it's as one word instead of with a dash. And I say this because the interrelatedness of people and technology is something we can't get away from in our everyday lives. It can't really be separated. We live with technology, whether we like it or we don't. And even though my podcast is called Progression to Analog, it's about, I want you to come away from this understanding both the benefits of analog experience and understanding analog elements about your employees and your team, but also how technology can really benefit you in everyday life. So in 1976, Albert Churns published the Principles of Socio-Technical Design. Now, as is with a lot of academic research, it's great, but it's pretty dense. And when I was reading it, I thought, this stuff is really great, but if we were to apply it to organizations, it would take a really long time. It's very dense, and it doesn't really apply to how things are in 2025. So I took some ideas from a few of the points, as we can see here, the compatibility, the information flow, the design and human values, and over the last 10 years of work and research, I have developed 4 principles of socio-technical design. So these we'll get into a little bit more in the presentation, but from a big picture level, it starts with everyday conversation. Digital communication is at the heart of everything that we do today. And a lot of times organizations want to have AI-driven change. They want to have sales-driven change. They want to have workplace design-driven change, but they're not looking at how employees are actually communicating, which is the baseline of everything that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. Now, also, it's important to observe our relationships with technology, especially in a hybrid and remote work settings. When employees are, when you might have bought, say, a $12 million software, but employees might not be using it. If you don't understand how employees are using things on an everyday basis, that can compromise the success of change management and of different things that you're trying to do as an organization. Now, it's also important to understand, how does place take a role in how things are getting done as an organization? Are you taking time to make sure that people are steeped in the place where they're working so that it doesn't feel like an airport or somewhere where they're just passing through? And also, as it pertains to data collection, are you prioritizing quantitative data or also qualitative data? Understanding more about the employee's everyday experience and getting real, honest feedback from them instead of just a once or twice a year survey. So all this sounds great, right? But technology does pose a lot of challenges to making all of this a reality. And this is where socio-technical design comes. So first, I want to explore, how can socio-technical design support sustainable organizations? So when we think about relationship-based work and our relationships, technology plays a critical role in all of them, relationships with ourselves, coworkers, and the company on a broader level. So thoughtful socio-technical design is about acknowledging that and creating an infrastructure that accounts for this essential role that technology plays in our workplaces and our workplace relationships. So it's not getting rid of technology, it's understanding the relationship we have with it and how we can better optimize it for people to feel better at work. Now, the first key to unlocking value from socio-technical design is understanding that there are two types of workers in today's workplace, and then designing spaces for each. Now, I want to note before I move to the next slide about the two workers that everyone can be each of these two types of workers. Oftentimes, when we are working remotely, we are more like an atomized individual. So an atomized individual, I first derived this concept from French sociologist Henri Lefebvre's 1940s Critique of Everyday Life. The atom, which is funny that he thought that in the 1940s, technology is making us more atomized. Imagine if he had seen iPad kids or smartphones. The atomized individual is detached from others and individualistic, and they can treat work as a set of inputs and outputs. Now, this isn't always bad. When we're trying to get things done and we're trying to be in a deep work setting, being an atomized individual is very beneficial. However, we also need to keep room for something called the collective contributor. So the collective contributor thrives in collaborative and interactive environments. And the collective contribution is essential for innovation, for problem solving, for team cohesion, and for coming up with big moonshot ideas. However, this approach to work is often deprioritized in digital-first environments. And also, I want to take a moment to pause and think about when we're going back and forth between remote work and in-person work, so hybrid work. Oftentimes, this shift from being a more atomized individual into a collective contributor is very difficult for employees. So I've found that employees find that shift to be very difficult. And so finding a way for employees to be able to do the type of work that works best for them, but also be a collective contributor is really important. Because a lot of times people think, hey, when I'm going back into the office, I need to put my head down and do work, and I can't just be chatting all day. Or they might think, why am I spending an hour traveling into the city when I'm just going to be on Zooms all day? So it's all about adjusting that process. Now, I do some interesting research that takes out-of-print technology magazines from over 7 decades, and I've traced thousands and thousands of pages of these to understand the message that has been peddled to us about technology over the past several decades. I want you to take a look at the person sitting at the desk with the computer with the tidal wave behind. This is what an atomized individual is at work. You're doing your own work, you're focused, you're going, but you oftentimes are not aware of the tidal waves that can be behind you because you're not working with others. And this is one of the dangers of hybrid and remote work, is because people are really acting as input output. Here's this assignment, here's this file, back and forth, instead of acting like a collective contributor. So all of this might make sense intuitively, but how do we implement this? So first, it all starts with this idea of everyday conversation, of looking at synchronous and asynchronous communication patterns. Now, what do I mean by that? There's two types of conversation in everyday life. There's synchronous dialogue, and there's asynchronous communication. So asynchronous communication is things like iMessage, it's things like Teams or Slack or email. It's things that don't happen in a steady stream. Now, synchronous dialogue is when you're on a Zoom speaking back and forth with someone or in-person meetings. Now, oftentimes companies spend more time on asynchronous communication than they might need to. Think about ping culture or Teams culture or Slack culture. You might be getting tons and tons of pings. Notification culture is what all this is about. So notification culture means that instead of really taking the time to think about a response, you're expected to just respond right away whenever you see a notification. And there's not a really great process from an organizational level on organizing the communication so that instead of sending 3 pings within a 15-minute session, you're taking the time, say over 30 minutes, to develop that thought and to send it in a way that makes communication more organized and more efficient. Now, to really picture how bad some of this is in terms of excess conversation and communication on an everyday basis for employees, I found this interesting statistics from the 2024 Microsoft and LinkedIn Work Trend Report. So 85% of emails are read in under 15 seconds, and the typical person has to read about 4 emails for every one that they send. Now think about that for a second. The typical person on your team has to read about 4 emails for every one that they send. And the data is showing that this is actually increasing every year. This data is from 2024. It's now almost 2026. So say that it might be 5.5 emails now for every one that they send. This is a lot of communication that we're having to deal with and just immediately process instead of taking time to think. And this reminds me of this advertisement that I found is this brains for sale. It feels like our minds are just for sale and that we're just trying to constantly optimize things. And we're not really understanding like, how can our brains be better working with men and machine? How can we find a better optimization for this? Now, to better picture how much everyday conversation streams overwhelms us on an everyday basis, I want to visualize this. So in the 1960s, we had these types of communication. We had in-person, letters, landline, and a little bit of the telegram. Okay, then we get to the 80s. So we're adding the landline, the fax, we have the landline, the fax machine, and the car phone, okay? Now in the 2000s, things really do start to change and pick up. We have the cell phone, email, Skype, text message, AIM, and early chat forums. However, a big difference here is that it's not embodied. You are still largely having to sit down at a computer, have dial-up internet, and wait for this type of communication. You're not able to bring it with you wherever you go. This has really changed in the 2010s and the 2020s. Now take a look at this for a second. Now, obviously, everyone may not be using every single one of these communication channels on an everyday basis, but there are 7 times the amount of communication channels available to us than just a few decades ago. And we have the same amount of time. I mean, we're not this is both in our personal lives and our professional lives. And I mention our personal lives because our personal lives bleed into the professional because we are constantly on our smartphone. And our smartphone is the way that we're supposed to go home and continue to answer our emails, but then we're always engaging in something that I refer to as hypercommunication. So hypercommunication is excess inbound or outbound communication that comes from technology. Hypercommunication, the best way to think about it is when you look at your phone and there's a ton of notifications and you feel like you cannot keep up. As you can see on the top, it's referred to also as an accelerator of inertia. Have you ever felt like you're on your phone all day, but you just can't respond to all the messages, that it's just too much? That's a result of hypercommunication. And hypercommunication is very dangerous in the workplace. It's dangerous because it makes people feel more burnt out. It abstracts them from the work. And when we're talking about designing for connection and having a socio-technical approach, people feel less and less connected and able to get to those higher levels of thought when they're feeling like they have to respond to everything immediately. That sense of immediacy is something that is necessary sometimes, but it's overused. And so when we're thinking about everyday conversation, a statistic that always gets to me is how much time people spend on asynchronous communication. So email, Slack, Teams. Estimates range from 3 hours and 43 minutes to 6 hours or more on the higher end. And I've seen a lot of this 6 hours or more on the higher end. So think about this. If 46 to 75% of an average workday is just spent on asynchronous communication, and yes, some of that time is certainly needed, how are we supposed to focus during our meetings and let alone get individual work done, ideate, create, or build meaningful relationships with our colleagues if we're just spending so much of our day going back and forth on pings, pings, pings? It's too much. Now, Asynchronous communication is very valuable in terms of sometimes things can be an email and not a meeting, but it is something that is overused, and that hypercommunicative tendencies can really impede innovation. Relationships within the organization are built through micro conversations or water cooler conversations and consistent everyday interactions, and not just scheduled check-ins and meetings. And this is part of the issue when we're flowing from remote work back into in-person work, is that people are very used to treating work as an input, output, and they're not paying attention to how might I be able to have a conversation with people in the workplace. And I'll get to this in a little bit, but headphones have a lot to do with this as well. I'll get to that more when we speak about principle number 3. So when we designate asynchronous communication for this exchange of information, so here is this file, let's have a meeting at this time, here are some materials I'd like you to review, and synchronous communication, so Zooms and in-person meetings, for this ideation, creation, connection, this can help eliminate that notification culture or that feeling that you have to immediately respond to everything, and can also increase collaboration and trust. So now, say that we've addressed some of the principles around conversation. So now we go to observing the relationships with technology. So understanding how your employees are working with technology is very important, and understanding this not just on a one-off basis, but on an everyday basis. How many softwares are they using on an everyday basis? Are they liking these softwares, or do they feel like it's actually impeding them from doing their job? Do they feel like they can speak with leadership about how these tools are being used in everyday life? So how do norms affect team technologies, and what can be improved here? And what tools help with everyday work, which are missing and which are redundant? And if employees rely more on this asynchronous communication versus in-person conversation, there might be a misalignment in tech use. And so that's important to really understand, is that where are the softwares that are solving some of the issues that we might have, and where are the ones that aren't? And especially as this relates to AI-driven change, a lot of organizations will come to me and say, well, we want to use AI, we want this ROI from AI now. But if you already have 4 different softwares that your employees are expected to use on an everyday basis, that might not work. You might want to understand a little bit more about what are the gaps, what can we get rid of, and what can we change, and have better communication processes around this, going back to principle 1. Now that we've considered communication and we've considered technology, let's take a moment to pause and think about place. Every single person on this webinar right now is in a different place, presumably, although some of you may be in different offices together, but in distinct places. I'm right now in my Lower Manhattan office in my apartment, and some of you might be in a physical office building. Now, psychogeography and the avoidance of the non-place is a very important thing to think about as we're trying to jointly optimize people and technology in the workplace. Psychogeography is a vehicle for self and group actualization, and is basically the way that our physical environments affects our behavior and emotion. It's the reason why when you go back to your childhood home, you might feel a certain way or act a certain way, or when you went to the library at college, that you might feel a little bit more productive. It's how places really unlock these certain levels in our brains, and that's ideally what we want to do at the office. We want to associate different places with certain behaviors. And the non-place, which was coined by Marc Augé in 1992, refers to impersonal transient spaces like airports or sterile office buildings that fail to foster meaningful human connection. I took this picture of the Deutsche Bank office in headquarters in Lower Manhattan as it transformed from a busy workplace to this non-place, and it was really fascinating to see. Now, if we're thinking about an example of the non-place within the workplace and how we might design against that, I come back to the idea of headphones. So I've had organizations come to me and say, hey, we've designed this wonderful office. We have everything that we might need, but people just aren't talking to each other. And I always ask, what is your policy on headphones? And I usually get puzzled looks thinking, what do you mean policy on headphones? So I've actually done this experiment where all year I have not worn headphones in public, except for in the air on a plane and occasionally while exercising. I've kept track of every instance of smartphone noise. And this is especially important. The New York Times actually just wrote an article on smartphone noise in the office and its negative effects. And Ryan Anderson from Miller Knoll was quoted in it. And it's important to understand, if you have a great shared space, but people are passing through it and they're stuck in their screens and they have their headphones in, you're not going to get that natural dialogue and that natural connection from the employees that really should be a part of an in-person workplace. And headphones are important. And if you, sometimes there's days where you're working through a lunch and you have to be on headphones and walk through common spaces. but having a lead by example type of mechanism where if you are in, say, a shared lunch space, the norm is to not have your headphones and is to be connecting with colleagues. That can be a great way to move forward in having employees connect better with each other. Now, as it pertains to psychogeography, again, is this effect of physical environments on behavior and emotion, and it emphasizes interpersonal connections to places and arbitrary routes. So really the point of mentioning psychogeography here is that people need to have this homey association with the office, except from an office perspective. They want to feel like they are able to be steeped in the place, and they want to feel like there can be some unplanned encounters or some ways that you can run into people and have some of these micro conversations. So conversation, again, is at the root of this socio-technical design. It's at the root of designing for connection, and it's something that has really fallen by the wayside in terms of technological progress. People are not speaking as much in public in terms of happenstance conversations. I've been interviewed about this recently for several different news outlets, just speaking about how I have not really observed this in public, and that is also true within the workplace. And it's important to have your colleagues have those happenstance conversations because it can be not only something that's fun, but in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, when you look at what happened there, this work was treated like an input, output, input, output. So you're getting on the meetings, and after the meetings, you're not able to then share, this might not be going well. You want to create opportunities for people to feel like they feel comfortable in this place, they feel comfortable in the conversation, and that they can participate in that type of dialogue. And with this, people form stronger workplace relationships in spaces that feel meaningful, that foster connection, and that allow for spontaneous interaction with colleagues. The spontaneous interaction is very important, but also we have to be realistic about the fact that many employees are very busy, have lots of meetings. So how can we, in these little in-between moments, design for connection and design for this spontaneous interaction? And to go back to this idea of the non-place, or this place where we might feel like there's no soul, so an airport or a gas station type thing, they emerge in the workplace when companies prioritize efficiency and neutrality over identity and social cohesion. So I'll say that again, when companies prioritize efficiency and neutrality over identity and social cohesion. And when we're avoiding the non-place, this means that we're creating workspaces that feel meaningful, culturally grounded, and conducive to organic interaction. Now, all this is great, but if we're not understanding what employees' needs are on an everyday basis, then all of this becomes pointless because we're not really understanding the needs of the employees. Now, this is why prioritizing qualitative data and understanding ethnomethodology is very important. And I know that's kind of a complicated word, but all that means is that we're trying to understand what employees are doing on an everyday basis in order to make changes within the workplace. Now, a lot of times I'll see organizations have very robust quantitative data structures set up, but when it comes to qualitative data, they're just throwing together random things to put on a survey. They're not really thinking about the types of outcomes. They're putting leading questions into it, and they're not really allowing for employees to feel psychologically safe, to feel like they can say what they want without retribution, and to get that type of data from them. So a good example of this is that if we're thinking about understanding employees' AI usage within the organization, instead of having one workshop and one survey from them a year, doing something called situated learning or applicable learning to the environment, where say that there's 2 5-minute lessons a week, and then at the end of the week, they have to share one little tidbit or sentence about how they use AI in a way that might be helpful to their colleagues. Then having that short digest that people can review is a really helpful way to knowledge share and to understand better data about employees. Because if people are getting into the habit of sharing opinions and sharing the way that they're using tools and conversing with their colleagues on a more regular basis, but not in a way that impedes upon their work, not having them do, say, 20 question surveys every week, then it just becomes a more efficient way that you can leverage real estate, that you can understand how are we leveraging every square foot of our property, how are we understanding a better way to design the workplace, to design the flow. Maybe you designed a certain room where you wanted something to happen and that's not occurring. Organizations oftentimes will come to me and say, hey, I thought that people were going to be conversing in this area, but they're not. This is how that can really help there. And so instead of simply measuring productivity metrics or engagement survey results, ethnomethodology asks how employees structure informal conversations. So are discussions happening organically in shared spaces, or interactions strictly scheduled. And this is a really important part of long-term success with organizations. How workplace tools are actually used. So employees default to email even when face-to-face interaction is possible. I see this a lot. How do people navigate physical and digital workplaces unconsciously? And what can we do to make those experiences better? Because there are parts about the digital workplace that are more efficient, that are more enjoyable for people. How can we make both of those work? And also, what unspoken norms shape workplace interactions? Are people feeling like they have to act a certain way, or how do things work positively? How can we keep track of all this? Now, I'll pause for a second here to think about how this might be applicable in a real world situation. Now, I've worked on these 4 principles of socio-technical design and other applications with lots of organizations, but I always like to use this fun example of how you can create a really interesting shared space by just a little bit of priming and policy. So in early 2023, I had this event at my apartment called Everyday Conversation, and I had 50 strangers. So most of the people did not know each other. They were just basically like second-degree connections of mine. And I had them come to my apartment in Lower Manhattan. I primed their presence there with intentional tech use policy, which I've now been able to apply to lots of different organizations. This intentional tech use policy is really an interesting way to get people to use their devices in ways that adhere better to the intentions of the space. So I said, welcome to Everyday Conversation. At this event, we'd like to encourage intentional tech use. Photos of anything in the apartment, exchanging contact information, etc. is encouraged. Scrolling, texting, work calls, and emails, please do your best to step aside or away if you must do any of these. Excited to have you here. And so one of the theses I had was that if we provided a lot of interesting material on the wall, so this was a film series that I did with film of everyday life from over 2 years. I also had a gallery of out-of-print technology magazines. So there was lots of things on the wall that people could stand next to each other and just have something to talk about. So for example, in an office, instead of having hotel art, do some type of prompt and say, hey, everyone, email a photo to Shannon about your last vacation or your last trip or something like that, and print it out and put it on the wall, and then have it be put in a conversational location. These things are small, but they make a big difference in making things feel like it's home. Have a prompt and then have people respond to it with Post-its, put it on the wall. Whatever that might be to steep people in the place and make it feel like it's a little bit more lived in. So at this event as well, as you can see, there was so much spontaneous dialogue. Actually, a short-term couple came out of it, lots of different work connections, and it was a really great way to show that you can put random people in a room and get them to talk and get them to be off their phones. These people were off their phones and they didn't know each other for over 4 hours. And this is something that's important in the workplace because we can design things so that people aren't addicted to their phones, that they're using it for more in a purposeful way. And that's something that's very important. This idea of a space being lived in too is important. So another great example is if you're a design organization, get a lot of like vintage magazines and periodicals and things and put them around in the shared spaces. Make sure that people know that they can rip pages out or use them or make things feel like they're lived in and make people feel like they can be there and share different tidbits and just have it feel a little bit less stale. Simple things like this can really go a long way. And it really makes a difference because then people are connecting and feeling great. And at this event too, my friend has a kava company, which is an alcohol alternative, and bringing things like that into the workplace, having different fun pop-ups is also a fun way to have that spontaneous interaction that I was speaking of before. It doesn't have to be an after-work event because largely people are wanting to do those less and less unless there's a specific purpose around it. It could be things that people can go to a break room and just have some type of interesting experience. So as we reflect just on some workplace problems and some subsequent socio-technical design solutions, I also want to talk about when we look at notification culture and how it's fragmenting focus and engagement, how the smartphone in both an individual and group level does this. So I have worked with organizations where we're really focusing on how individuals in a said team are using their smartphones and then how that might approach the way that a group within the organization is having this notification culture. Since the 5th of September 2022, without exception, have begun every morning reading nonfiction before any phone or computer use. And while that seems a little bit extreme, for the past 3 or so years, I've worked with executive teams where you can actually just say to them, any direct and unmediated experience for the first 5 minutes of your day, whether that's taking a shower, brushing your teeth, can really ground you in knowing that you don't need to respond to everything right away. The key word's everything. Obviously, some things do need to be, but it's all about, slowly untangling this notification culture and reducing that tool redundancy. And also just taking a look at when employees are not engaging in conversation despite return to office. How can we design office spaces for everyday micro conversations? How can we leverage psychogeography and create environments to facilitate relationship building and that spontaneous collaboration? But also look at what the employees want. Like, do they want dedicated workspaces? Is an open office plan too complicated for them? Get the data on that, but also don't ask for things that might not be able to be delivered on. That's another thing that I see in the qualitative data piece of organizations, is that sometimes organizations are asking employees whether they want things, but they never really have the intention to deliver on them. So be careful about the things that you're asking and make sure that it can align. This idea of too many Zooms, even when people are in the office, is something that we also want to work against and prioritize collaboration and not remote style meetings, although that obviously can be a complicated process. So oftentimes hot desks and generic airport art design can make workplaces feel impersonal. We've touched on a lot how bringing localized aesthetics and cultural identity and personalized team spaces can help reduce that negative effect. And then employees, when they're avoiding shared spaces and defaulting to their desks and screens, that is a more complicated thing that I work on a lot with organizations. We're able to solve that usually in around a quarter, but it is about understanding month to month how things are changing and how we can really consider this conversation forward designed to naturally facilitate some of those micro conversations that are very important in developing mentorship opportunities and developing relationships with employees and making sure that employees feel like they want to stay at the organization, that they're not just wanting to leave at the drop of the hat. And a few in closing, workplace problems and socio-technical design solutions are, when meetings feel unproductive, but traditional surveys don't reveal why. This might be because you're not understanding the everyday basis of employees' understanding, and also you might be poorly designing the survey. And so that's something to think about. When company invests in workplace tech, but the adoption is low, it might be, again, because it's not really what the organization needs, or it might just be because they don't really understand how to leverage the tool. So understanding what is going on there is also important. And how can we structure our return to office program to what will employees respond positively? So having employee insights centered around this honest everyday use is very important. And all of this flows, right? So we're first looking at everyday conversation and trying to avoid this notification culture, understanding the way that the people communicate and how this might differ from organization to organization. If you are a corporate M&A firm, that's going to differ the amount of notifications you might need to have versus, say, if you're a design firm that works with a select amount of clients, and that's important to understand. Really understanding the relationships with technology and how that can link to the conversation, how employees can better knowledge share and say, hey, I'm using X tool in this way. And so everyone at the organization can move in a desired way. Understanding how place really impacts the way that we work and impacts the way that we communicate and bond with our teammates is also of importance. And really looking at this all as a cycle to really understand on an ongoing basis, how are people communicating? How are people having relationships with technology? What is the impact of the place? And understanding the relationship that everyday behavior has on all of this. And as I close, I want to just have us think on a larger perspective, why all of this is important, right? In this AI-driven world, why is it important to think about things from a socio-technical perspective? And I will do questions at the end, but I did see one thing pop up that I do want to address is there need for light conversation where colleagues, not friends? This does vary based on cultures, but I think one thing that's important is that the light conversation can be about work. It can be about different projects, and it can be about ideation, creation, connection. And that piece is lost when we are fully remote or when we're not paying attention to those micro conversations in the office. And so that's also important. It's not really about being best friends. It's about really efficient knowledge sharing and how digital communication can make that inefficient. So the rise of this artificial intelligence and algorithmic-based technologies has caused a shift in the workplace, overvaluing these technical areas of work, so AI and data, which are important, but they're often valued at the expense of the social. So communication, people, and culture. And the levels to which these are all important, again, will vary based on organization, will vary based on region, will vary based on needs of the employees. But ideally, work should be this dialectic of exchange between technology and more traditional analog elements. I love this illustration from a partner that I've worked with, Anna Lahtinen out of Finland, and showing that going hand in hand, person and machine, is a very important part about today's workplace, is that we do not live in analog utopia where pen and paper is going to be the most efficient way, nor is that really a utopia, because technology has so many amazing pieces to the workplace. But alone, this technological determinist, cybernetic idealist, way of looking at the workplace, thinking that technology alone can solve everything, is also not the best way to look at organizational change. And really what it's about is this, progression to analog, and looking at some analog elements like conversation as a form of progress in addition to technology, and not in in replacement of. And so it is, again, about this dialectic of exchange between technology and more analog elements. And thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Yeah, just so much more. I'm going to ask a question. If I spotted something in one of the slides that talked about unplanned drift through a space. Could you tell me a little bit more about unplanned drift?
Yeah, so the derive, which is a situationist concept, is basically that a lot of our paths are unplanned, are pre-planned. So we go on a certain running route, and we have the exact route, and we're timing exactly how long that's taking us. And any type of unplanned route, whether that's a different way that you walk to work, a slightly different footpath, or a slightly different route in the office, or going a different way so you might encounter a different colleague who you don't speak to that often. That's an important part of everyday life, not only in the workplace, but in our personal lives, because it's a way of unlocking creativity and not looking at everything as so rote and so mundane.
Thank you. There was an observation from one person here that actually the headphones only work, or having no headphones, only work in spaces where you actually want to be spoken to, which is why, people don't want to be interrupted. So what about that challenge where people use them as a sign, I'm heads down?
Yeah, and they should be able to be used as a sign that your head's down. I know when I was at LinkedIn, and there would be some times when the open office plan just didn't work for me, I was working heads down, and I see this with clients that I work with as well. The point with the headphones policy is not to be, it needs to be off in X setting, or it needs to be on. It's to try to encourage people that when you do have a free moment or two, maybe just pause your music for a minute and walk through the shared space without the headphones. That's all. And it's all about the nuance, because I think a lot of times in this technology-driven world where people are watching videos for under a second every time they're scrolling, nuance can be lost. And so it's not about having a policy that feels restrictive on people, because that will inhibit things as well. But it's about that balance.
Great. If you could stop sharing, that would be great as well, by the way. That okay. Also, someone's asked, when you talk about meaningful spaces, could you clarify what that means? What's a meaningful space?
That's going to vary based on the team, the region, and the type of work. But largely what we're saying by meaningful is that we're trying to oppose the non-place. We're not trying to make it feel like it is just a sterile environment, like it's somewhere we can just pass through, like an airport or a gas station. Now, certain types of workplaces, say that it's finance, they're not going to need all these like kitschy things of like the pictures on the wall and all that kind of stuff. But then it's really important to get technical about, or say in government applications, it's really important to get technical around how you can, what are some of the organizational goals that you're trying to achieve? Say that that's more collaboration between employees. Well, then how can you design that space for more meaningful dialogue? That's a consideration.
Great, thank you. I think you did cover this a bit, but Avery asked, do you think most organizations actually recognize the importance of informal workplace interaction? Or is there still a lot of work to do to move decision makers away from efficiency and neutrality?
More and more so, I think, yes. I think it again depends on the region and the type of work. But the more that collaboration and communication is valued, I see it as when a lot of times companies do have to run into issues in their own organization before they see a value in it. But I do think that the more that articles and things are shared and case studies, that people start to see the value of it. I work a lot with Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School, the pioneer of psychological safety. And she and I have spoken a lot about this, about how these chance encounters are what lead to these big moonshot types of innovation. And I think having bigger voices start to speak about these topics and to show that it doesn't have to mean that you're getting stopped by every person to talk about their life for 20 minutes. I want to make sure that I'm emphasizing that. It's really about making sure that when you have you might come out of a meeting and think, wow, there might be an opportunity for X to bridge with Y. And my colleague Tom is right next to me, and I know that he's an expert in this. Let me just chat about that with him really quickly. Whereas, if you were via Zoom, you might not have been able to do that. But also in remote cultures, if you have a base where you've met Tom in person and you know what he's like, you might then feel more comfortable to say, hey, Tom, can we just have a 15-minute check-in? I want to just see what you're working on and what I'm working on, see if there might be any overlaps, and then be able to move from there.
I'm going to read quite a bit here because there's a couple of comments that are linked here. Stephanie mentions this: designing for conversation seems very critical. There's research suggesting that younger generations struggle to have light conversations with co-workers. They prefer digital communication. So making it part of the fabric of an organization and making it easier is really important. And then someone's made a comment here. This is super great information. I wonder how we can best communicate with the younger generations in the office that are email and chat only and fear direct conversation or live phone. And then, sorry, one more. Colin actually added, he read today that some youngsters avoid interpersonal conversation and actually sometimes ask ChatGPT to give them some conversation chart starters. Lots of information there, but a huge challenge.
That all is true, but I think something is really interesting. So when I started this smartphone noise study, there was only one comparable study on who's playing their phone out loud and who is most, say, stuck in the screen on an everyday basis. And the data was showing that it was mostly younger people. Now, in my work and research over the last 10 and a half months, I've actually seen that it's very evenly distributed across generations, that people are equally stuck in their screens. So why that's interesting is that, yes, on a generational basis, people might be interacting with technology differently and are. The younger generations actually are more hungry for conversation and direct connection than you might think. And here's some data to prove that. In the last 3 years, when I've been studying a lot of analog trends, I've never seen more of a hunger for phone-free events than ever before. And this is largely with the ages 18 to 35, of people wanting to put away their phone and to understand what it was like to have this analog type thing. I'm currently writing a book on this topic, which will be out sometime late next year or the year after. And in some of the conversations and initial research that I've had, it's actually not so much about being reliant on GPT, although that is the case in some places. It's not understanding what the alternative looks like, because a lot of these people started their career in a digital forward environment. And so if you're going to have early in career people only be in a digital environment, then there needs to be a more concerted effort to have them understand, here's how you can initiate a 15-minute check-in. Here's the importance of doing this. Because I know when I started my career at LinkedIn, my dad said to me, schedule 15-minute one-on-ones with people that you might not know if you have a collaboration initiative with them. And I've carried that into my work here because, there are a lot of people who might not know that, who might not have a parent who's telling them that. And so that's why knowledge sharing is so important, and understanding also why ethnomethodology is important is because generational markers are important, but they're also a little bit sometimes overused because generations really depend on a lot of things. They depend on birth order, they depend on socioeconomic status, they depend on region, a lot of different things. So I'm born late 94 and I'm more of a cusp person. So if you're assuming, say that you have 10 people in the office born 98, you might be assuming different technology needs or preferences when they might be a little bit different. And so that's why the ongoing understanding of how people actually are using the tools and giving people the chance to say what they feel uncomfortable with about their current technology. Is give someone the opportunity to say, I feel like I'm a little bit over reliant on GPT and I'd love to not be. Make sure that there is that element of psychological safety. That's how you can get to these breakthroughs.
Great. Thank you. Colin says, all of this is great if there's a high trust environment, but that's not the norm, sadly. How do you do this in a low trust environment? Doesn't a return to office policy mitigate against this because it breeds resentment and disengagement?
Well, high trust is critical for all of us. It really is, because low trust is one of the things that increases turnover in organizations. Because if you don't trust your colleagues, and if you, it's interesting. My research was featured in a Harvard Business Review book recently called "Why Are We Here?" and it spoke about how even an office friendship is so important. In a singular office friendship is so important in long-term people staying there. And the problem, yes, is that when there becomes a top-down organization, a top-down methodology of leaders saying, we are out of nowhere. We were a remote forward organization, and now we're going back 4 days a week. That totally erodes trust. It really does. And that's where actually a more collective organization model is better, in obviously having some things that if you're, as a leadership team, say that you might meet and say, okay, we really need to be in the office at minimum 3 days a week, but let's see how people are reacting to this. It's important to get the employees' opinions on this, because that's really going to affect the way that people are adhering to it long term. However, you also need to be realistic about the business outcomes and about the positive impact that sometimes in-person work has. I mean, it again depends on the organization and the industry that you're in. If you're a highly technical organization that was developed remote first, if you have a lot of late in career salespeople, remote first works a lot of times. But if you have a lot of early in career, if it's design, if it's creative, the data says that being in person is, finance, government is better. And the way that you can establish that high trust is by authentic, direct conversation with people. I mean, I did a TikTok recently. I share a lot of this information on TikTok as well, about how the difference between the California no, which is when they say, yeah, maybe, and the Dutch communication, which people are very, forthcoming and direct, and developing more of a direct communication style in line with Dutch communication is something that every organization really should strive for, because it's a way of just ripping off the Band-Aid but not being offensive. It's about a way of saying, hey, as leaders, we need to go back into the office for at least 2 days a week because of X, Y, Z. If that doesn't work for your schedule, we understand that, but we need to move forward as an organization for these reasons. Whereas a lot of times it comes in a way that's not really forthcoming, and that really does erode trust. So yes, to this person's point, trust is an integral part of this.
Great, thank you. Now we will have quite a few people on from the real estate facilities management world. And John's asking, how could you measure and evaluate the psychogeography of space? Have you seen that happen, or is it possible?
Yeah, a sales team is a great example of how you would measure that. So for one thing that's interesting, in a client that I've worked with recently, is that they said that when they had their sales team go totally remote, that they saw the amount of leads generated go down by about 45%. And that was because of this knowledge sharing and not having the sense of place be associated with knowledge sharing and be associated with, they were afraid to fail, they were staying on calls too long. And so when we brought them back to the office in a way that was in a hybrid way, that sense of place was designed around knowledge sharing. People heard their colleagues failing, and they're like, that's okay. It's actually just a little bit more around volume. And so you're designing the place so that people are then associating it with productivity and knowledge, and then able to then bring that back to their remote workplace and have that tied to it. So sales is one piece of that. An additional thing is it depends again on the team and on the outcomes. Employee satisfaction with the space may differ again from person to person, from organization to organization. Some organizations you don't need to have as much conversation as others. Again, if it's like a design oriented environment, a collaborative environment, you're going to need to have more conversation, versus if it's a more technical environment, or if it's a finance type environment like that, it's going to differ. But there are ways, including with sales, with employee retention is another great way to measure it. That's something that we've done have a lot of data on that, and that employee retention is something that a lot of organizations do not think about, and how much that costs them when they lose an employee. And if making the place better for the employees when they do have to come back to the office prevents them from leaving, tracking that data is also important, because that can be a great way to show value. Another way is that when we're looking at these principles of socio-technical design, if you have too many softwares that you're spending money on, so say that like there's $20 million in software, but you actually only need, I see this a lot, say 3 million, that's an immediate cost savings, where then you can justify some of these more sociological oriented things around place and get a little bit more. So that's what we do as a applied research lab, is take all these things that sound great in theory, right, but then also apply them to how we can make it work for commercial real estate, how we can make it work for different parts of work where we're in this economy and in this larger macro environment. It is important to show how things really result in value.
Thank you. I'm probably going to make this the last question. Tobias asks, have you seen any AI technologies that are currently in place that actively help aid human to human connection rather than replace it?
That's a complicated question. I will say that there is an interesting statistic again from Microsoft and LinkedIn's workforce report that over 70% of employees are BYOAI or bringing their own AI to work. And so whether we like it or not, understanding the way that employees are using AI is important. However, I think that the best use case of AI within organizations, again, this really varies based off of industry and region, but is a way of reducing time spent on menial tasks. So for example, if you're a organization like a research-based organization and you need to submit a paper and the citations are in one format and you need to go to the other format, that would take 2 hours manually to switch it. Now GPT can switch it, in say 10 minutes, and that's a great thing. I I am wary on having AI be a marker of connection. I think that what it can be is can increase efficiency within organizations. I think that the connection piece has to come from a more sociological and people-oriented place, but there are so many organizations that are not leveraging AI correctly because it's a scary, rightfully so, thing. The best tip I can give there is to find one part of the organization, usually in marketing or in something related to communications that you might want to make a little bit more efficient, or in say, organization of, with executive assistants of schedules, and help find one or two use cases so that you can move forward there. But in this AI education, it's also important to help people become aware of hallucinations and of things that, because this over reliance on AI is something very dangerous. So long-winded way of saying that immediately, no, AI, I don't think is the marker to make people more connected, but what it can do is reduce time to spend on menial tasks, which then can open up time in the everyday for people to have that more analog connection.
I did say that was going to be the last question, but someone's asked a question I meant to ask this morning as well. Does psychogeography and neuroscience meet anywhere?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think that a lot of these things overlap. My role as a sociologist is to take a lot of take group behaviors and how people are physically acting and to design spaces around that. But we've worked with people that are in those areas and understanding more around how the brain mechanisms behind it. I think there's so much to be said around how our minds are affected by our physical spaces, and it's not something that it is often thought about just something that only a design organization might think about, but it is something that I've done with a lot of companies that you might not even think would need these things, like in government or in law a lot. I've worked with a lot of law firms. Like it really can be something that can be wide ranging and yes, does relate to what you just mentioned.
Caitlin, thank you very much for a fantastic session. I've really enjoyed listening to this again. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And yeah, everyone on here, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, send me an email, and would love to chat further. It's always fun to get all the questions and insights from everybody.